Okay, so how did the US get its shape from 1776 to what it looks like today? And how does it impact me? This is what you have to be able to tell with this document that you're going to be turning in, and especially with the summary at the end and the questions that you ask. So let's take a look at what it was like before it was the United States. Now you can see on here that all the borders, let's project this full screen. You can see all the borders of Canadian provinces, the US and Canada, and states. But remember, those lines are pretty new lines. They're maybe only, 100 to 200 years old. Whereas all these nations of American Indians were here for thousands of years. And if you notice, there's so many, especially along the coast, because of all of the food sources, all of the water sources, all of the trade and travel and transportation and the climate. There is a reason, like today, why so many people live on the coasts. And it's for the same reason that so many American Indian nations were on the coasts. Just a lot of resources. This one shows you just the United States. And again, it gives you a little appreciation for how many different nations were in these different areas. Like, look at New York City. You can't even see the names of all the different nations that were there. Last year, you learned about the Dakota and about the Ojibwe. And just think about how harsh our weather is, our climate, how hard it is to grow things here, how difficult the resources are to find in the wintertime. There's a reason why there's a lot more spread out, a lot less people in the middle here. But along the coasts, it's jam-packed. This is a map that shows how the United States and the indigenous nations traded hands over the period of 100 years. Now, the people who make this map call it an invasion. And obviously, from the perspective of American Indians, when you look at how this map changes, and you see land being lost, blue land is American Indian land, and you can literally see it being lost to the United States. And if you notice, it goes pretty darn fast, especially as we get into the 1840s, 50s, 70s, and 80s. It goes from almost the entire western half to almost nothing left except for some reservations. And you see the number of acres seized. We're up to 1.2 billion acres in 1881, 1.4 billion acres in the 1890s, and it ends in 2010 with 1.5 billion acres taken. And they give credit to the sources that they used to create that. Here is another one. If you click the link here, you can actually interact with this yourself. But this is also a map that shows you from 1818 how quickly American Indian nations, all of these American Indian nations, went from being like that to the United States that you see today with only small reservations. So let's take a watch at this. So, as you can see, it was made by the National Museum of the American Indian, which is the Smithsonian, one of the national museums in Washington, D.C. And so they give credit here at the end to all the people who were part of it and who helped make that short film. And then they give credit to where the images came from. And you'll notice a lot of them come from the National Archives, Library of Congress, and other historical societies from around the country. And you will have to get your own sources from those kinds of places as well as you do research throughout this year. And so you have to make sure you get factual things just like they did. Now, we know whose land this was for thousands of years. We know what the impact of that was. Let's dig into this story further of how the U.S. got to be the shape that we know it as today. It starts with the 13 colonies. And if you follow along with your paper, you can see all the who, what, when, where, why. And let's talk about the how here. England was told by the colonies, we don't want to be part of England anymore. And England said, well, too bad. You are staying with England. And then, of course, the Revolutionary War is where the colonies tried to separate from England. And we know, spoiler alert, that England would eventually say, fine, it's too expensive, it's too many lives lost, we will let you be independent. And so the Treaty of Paris was what was signed to end the Revolutionary War. And like it says on the left side of the screen there, the treaty, even though the U.S. declared independence, the treaty was a formal declaration, was a formal agreement that the English recognized the U.S. as its own nation. And then so the U.S. then made sure that France signed it to agree that the U.S. was a nation. And then they made sure the Spanish and the Netherlands signed it, because in order to be a nation, you need to be officially recognized by other countries. And now notice this right here. It said on this map, the dark green is the original 13 colonies. See that? It's red here, it's dark green there, but that's the original 13 colonies. In the Treaty of Paris, though, England gave the United States all the land to the Mississippi, all the land up to the Great Lakes, all the land down to Florida, which was still controlled by Spain. This light green land is part of the land that 20 years before this, in 1763, England told the American Indian nations of this area, we will keep the American colonists out of your lands. And this is one of the things that the American colonists were very upset at England about. They wanted to keep pushing west and were angry that England wasn't going to let them push American Indians out. But when England said, okay, it's all yours, they also said, we are no longer protecting that border that we made with the American Indian tribes. And so the U.S. said, well, we're no longer going to respect that border either. And we know what happened, because we can see it happen right there. Now, the Louisiana Purchase is the next thing. There's a lot written down here, and I'm not going to read it to you because you can read it yourself. But the Louisiana Purchase, as you can see here, it doubled the size of the U.S. Instead of going just from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, Great Lakes to Florida, all this land west of the Mississippi became part of the United States. And if you've ever been to St. Louis or ever heard of the Gateway Arch, this is what it looks like. It's giant. You can take an elevator all the way up to the top there. It's massive, massive. It's beautiful. And at the Gateway Arch, there is a museum. And it's called the Gateway Arch because St. Louis, which is where the Mississippi and the Missouri River meet, was seen as the gateway to the West. People who wanted to go into the Western U.S. would come through the East. They'd usually end up in St. Louis and then go west from there. When you looked at all those trails on that geo inquiry that we did, a lot of the trails, like the Oregon Trail, they started in the area around St. Louis, or you could access them from St. Louis. And so a lot of people passed through there, and it's called a gateway to the West. But in that museum in St. Louis, they do a good job of talking about the complexity of this history. It's not all good. Yeah, the United States got more land. It got some of the most valuable farmland in the world. Everything up here in Minnesota that's west of the Mississippi became part of the U.S. with this purchase. But it also has negative impacts as well. You know about the loss of the land for the American Indians. We also know that this brought, if we go further a couple more maps, the Louisiana Purchase now made it so that the U.S. had a border with Mexico. And the U.S. was a newly independent nation, and so was Mexico. And that's a tension that would also build at the time and would bring the two countries to disagreements and war. Having the Louisiana Territory also open up, there was slavery in the United States. And slavery in 1803 was starting to go away. It was starting to fade. Most states in the North that had slavery had gotten rid of it. And states down here, they were starting to transition to a different kind of economy. But as the West opened up, a lot of people said, this is going to be new areas where we can move slavery. And people who were against slavery said, whoa, no, we have slavery. We're trying to get rid of it. And if we allow it to go into here, slavery will continue in our nation for who knows how long. And so the debate over slavery really intensified. And only 60 years after this, we would find ourselves in the middle of the deadliest war in U.S. history, the Civil War. And so all that debate about racism, immigration, poverty, the treatment of different groups of people are still issues that we grapple with and deal with today. So like it says at the end there, the very land you walk on has a complicated story. And it's important to understand how it got into your hands, because now you are part of the story and you are going to help write the next chapter. You're going to decide, how do we look back and how do we look forward, and how do we resolve all this complexity, all this drama? Like we talked about in class, usually if we ignore drama, it comes back worse. So how can we avoid that? How can we solve that? How can we resolve that? Or can we? You have a lot of power and a lot of thinking to do here. Florida is another place with a complicated story of how this land became part of the United States. It was separate from the United States. And Spain did not have a lot of tight controls over it. They let the colony sort of run itself. And one of the things that we find is that a lot of the American Indian nations that were down here had a lot of power and ran things and did not have a belief in slavery. And so people who were enslaved up here in these U.S. states, if they escaped, all you had to do was cross this border and you were in a nation where slavery was not allowed. So you would be free. And while, like it says in here, we see that today, obviously, no slavery is a good thing, people who owned slaves in that time period considered an escaped slave to be missing property. Or sometimes slaves who would escape down here, people who were enslaved who escaped to Florida, would go with some Seminole American Indians and other escaped enslaved people, And they would go and they would raid some of the plantations here to rescue their family members, to help free other people. And that was not looked upon too favorably by the people in this area. And so the United States started to invade Florida and take the land back. And Spain, not wanting to get involved in this dispute and defend it, eventually sold that land to the United States. And then the United States continued to push into Florida to push out the American Indians, to return escaped enslaved people to a state of slavery. Um, that sounds all negative, and it is. But an advantage that gaining Florida did was it helped the United States secure access to the Gulf of Mexico. Now that this was part of the U.S., you could sail into the Gulf of Mexico, into New Orleans, into all the different ports that were here and would become here, and be in American waters the entire time. And that is extremely important today when you consider how many resources flow in and out of New Orleans, how many resources are in the Gulf of Mexico. So again, like it says at the end here, this is a story with positive and negative impacts that we can't go back in time and change, but we can understand how it brought us to this point and decide how we can go ahead. Also in 1818, the U.S. and British Canada, England was, still dominate. Canada was part of England. And so they solved this border up on the north here. But notice the U.S. also settles this border here between the U.S. and Mexico. Okay, so what this gives us here is we talked about Treaty of Paris, we talked about the Louisiana Purchase, talked about Florida. Now we get to this Texas annexation. If you remember, I just literally said that this border had been solved, but there were people that wanted to go into this land here that was part of Mexico. And at first, Mexico allowed some of them to come in from the United States, but too many folks were coming in. And so, like it says right here, Mexico tried to close the border. But people from the U.S. kept coming in against the law of Mexico. And not everybody in the U.S. thought that should be happening. Now, this led to war with Mexico. It led to the U.S. invading further into Mexico and led to the Mexican Cession, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And you also did some more research later on in this document. But like I wrote here, when you look at the modern debate over immigration from Mexico, it's more complicated than this story. You can see that Texas, Arizona, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, California, Nevada, Utah, a lot of Colorado, part of Oklahoma and Kansas, part of even Wyoming, were part of this, were part of Mexico. And where do we go here? When the treaties were signed and the lands were transferred from Mexico to the United States, thousands of people went along with that based on where you live. And also notice people who lived in those areas of which was Mexico, they spoke Spanish. Now, do you think that we can see that today? If you look at the Mexican Cession and you look at what used to be Mexico, Texas, and the Mexican Cession, and then you look at today, where do Spanish speakers in the United States live? Look at that. You can see the border. So where people are speaking Spanish today in the United States is the part of the United States largely that used to be claimed by Spain that used to be part of Mexico. And so Spanish has been spoken in most of these places longer than the United States existed. You'll notice there's a pocket of Spanish speaking up here, and this was also claimed by Spain at one point in time. I do not believe, though, they had colonies up there. But Spain did have colonies down here in Florida, and we know that the U.S. got Florida from Spain. And if you notice, you can still see Spanish is a dominant language in different parts of Florida. And so we can see what happened here in our modern world, in our country today. The other thing that I have written here that I want you to think about is people who lived here one day went to sleep in Mexico. They lived in Mexico their entire lives. They were born in Mexico. And then one day they wake up and learn that a treaty has been signed and that where they're living, which has been Mexico their entire life and their grandparents' life and so on and so forth, is now part of the United States. And I've put this on the screen before, and it freaks people out and leads to some good discussion. Unfortunately, we don't have time to talk too much about this year, but I did want to show you this. If, theoretically, Minnesota was transferred, Canada and the U.S. sit down, draw up a treaty, president signs it, and suddenly you went to sleep in Minnesota as part of the United States, and you wake up the next day only to find out that it is part of Canada. Overnight, suddenly your citizenship status has changed, and you are now under the power of the Canadian government, and they may or may not choose to count you as full citizens of Canada. Your life would really be turned upside down. And that's what happened to the people of the areas of Texas and Mexico, who were now under U.S. control. And in many ways, that keeps coming back. We see even sometimes in the 1950s, people who were U.S. citizens, but because they had Mexican ancestry, were actually deported, even though they had been born in what was the United States. So it's very complicated. Like it says right here, there's even more complicated matters in all of that. And we don't have time to get into that. You will choose to get into that further if you would like to. There are some great topics here related to History Day that if this is interesting to you, you could solve. But no matter what, it's important to know that our modern discussions, our modern disagreements, our modern debates, they go way back. And as a country, we were divided with what to do with Texas and with war with Mexico back then. A lot of people in the United States did not think we should go to war with Mexico. People debated. They made unpopular decisions. And we inherited the impacts of those actions today, both good and bad. Now, we could ignore that complicated story, or we can use it to help us understand the consequences of our own actions, good and bad. We can also use it to understand what might seem like a simple issue actually has some very deep and complicated history to it. So the last big chunk, actually not the last big chunk, Oregon's the last big chunk. We talked a little bit more about here's what Mexico and the U.S. looked like in 1830. And 18 years later, this is what the border is settled at. And except for a little chunk of land there, this is pretty much what the border looks like today. And so another interesting impact that this has that I talk about in here is that this border dispute has a lot to do with the United States getting involved in World War I. The U.S. was trying to be neutral. It was a war between the Germans and the French, the British, and the Russians, and other countries in Europe. The U.S. was providing supplies to all sides of the war, but for the most part was helping out England and France. And the Germans didn't like that. And so the Germans started sinking our ships that were going across the ocean. And Germany was trying to get the United States to stop doing that. Then Germany was worried that the United States would join the war. And so Germany thought they would distract the United States. And a famous telegram called the Zimmerman telegram was sent to Mexico. And the Germans told Mexico, if you invade the United States and try to take back your lands, we will support you, Mexico. And they were hoping that if Mexico did that, the United States would not get involved in World War I and would instead defend its southern border. And that telegram was intercepted by British spies. And when the US found out about it, and Americans found out that Germany was threatening us at home by trying to be allies with Mexico, a lot of Americans said, we need to go to war against Germany. And so it completely backfired on Germany. But that is a big part of what brought the US into being a world power, our role in World War I. And then the treaty that ended World War I is what led to World War II and is what propelled the United States to becoming, one of the largest superpowers in the world. And that's a role that we've had since then. So like I said right here, studying these stories is like touching a spider web. You might think you're touching just one little part, but you quickly learn that it's all connected and so much more complicated than you ever could have imagined it. And rather than fear that complication, it's important to understand it so that you can see that you have power over the future of this country and that you need to understand the past in order to understand the present and make decisions over the future. Now, the last chunk, Oregon. We already talked about how the U.S. and Britain settled that border up there. But people from the U.S. were not supposed to go into Oregon. But because the U.S. wanted it, because a lot of people in the U.S. wanted it, they said, you go in there and we'll see what happens. You shouldn't get in trouble. Try it. Cross the border illegally. Settle it. And if we get enough people in there, the British will have to just agree to give it to us. And rather than do two countries go to war, they sat down and settled the treaty over this disputed area, and the U.S. got Oregon. They wanted more, but Canada wanted more the other way. And in the end, they settled with this border right here to avoid war. And we pretty much end up with the shape of the United States that we have today. So, on your paper, in your own words, how did the United States grow from a nation of 13 states on the East Coast into the shape of the country that we know it to be today? And what questions do you still wonder about? Good luck. Can't wait to read what you write. Make sure you ask me questions if you've got them.